Welcome back to Stablecoin in Gaming, our podcast, the show where we unpack how digital money is reshaping the future of play. I am your host, Flav, from the Blockchain Game Alliance. And for today's episode, we'll dive into a shift that's been quietly transforming the iGaming world. Stablecoins, moving from a flashy payment solution, reward systems as well, to the invisible infrastructure, aiming to disrupt, power the entire ecosystem. To break down this evolution from being crypto games, crypto and gambling, we're joined by one of the sharpest voices in the scene, in the space, with Jamie Zammitt, Managing Director and SVP, Commercial Gaming and Crypto and BVNK. And I'm very happy to have him with us for that conversation. Hello, Jamie. How are you doing? And welcome to the show.
Hi, Flavian. Very, very well. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Really looking forward to having an interesting conversation with you today.
I'm very excited on a lot of different for a lot of different reasons. First and foremost, from the conversation we had last week to talk about kind of try to prepare our conversation, obviously based on your involvement in the space, but also with a few good news we've seen happening both BVNK. We're going to talk about that for sure very quickly. But before that, we'd love to learn more about yourself. How did you come up with these crazy world of iGaming, but also crypto?
Yeah, so a bit about me. I'm actually based out of Gibraltar. I'm born and bred in Gibraltar, so one of the gaming capitals, or one of the big iGaming pioneers on the planet, right?
Yeah.
So gaming was always very, very close to everything that we did here in Gibraltar. And so I've been in the gaming industry myself for a long time. I've worked for the likes of Pragmatic Play, who are the biggest content provider and platform provider on the planet these days. And I've worked for other entities too in the gaming space. But then I also veered into the payment space. Crypto was also very close to my heart. I got into it personally at quite early, in around 2016.
Oh, wow.
And so that kind of married those two things very, very well together in being able to bring those two passions, let's say, and that kind of backdrop of my career so far, and bring them all into one.
So we're talking to a real OGs. If you actually went into crypto from 2016, what was the haha moment on your side? Was it around payment because you were into it, or something else for blockchain specifically as a whole?
Yeah, good question. Not at that point, Flavian, to be honest. At that point, the stablecoin aspect of things hadn't really gathered pace. And I think we'll probably go into a bit more of that detail further along than on this call. But at that point, there was more of that, the liberal aspect of what crypto represented, that crypto ethos, is really what attracted me to the space, right?
Yeah.
And that's very, very different to a lot of what we're going to talk about today. But from a personal perspective, in answer to your question, that's really what drove me, like something different that felt like where the system could be rebuilt, right? At least in some ways, to the monetary system that we had existed until now, which is just ingrained in us, that it has to be the way it is because it's always been like that, right? Okay. And this was that escape of, hang on, it doesn't have to be, where you can push power to the edges, where you don't have to trust a single actor or a single group of actors like we have had to for the past. Obviously, we're not quite there yet, but that's kind of what got me into the space originally, that's for sure.
Yeah, I agree with that. I had the same experience, and maybe you are in this situation where back then you thought that it's mind-blowing, it will break, it will not break, but it will disrupt a lot of industries and the way we see the world. But back then it feels like it's going to come in friction in a few years, but actually it's going to be a little bit more than that. I don't know if you have this feeling of it's coming, but actually, we need to do a lot of things before that. But I do rely on your experience. Jamie, we've obviously seen, I don't know for the others, but the headlines last month, a few weeks before, about MasterCard acquisition of BVNK, which is a wonderful news for our ecosystem in blockchain. Without turning that into a press release, because this is not the purpose of that conversation, from your point of view, what does a traditional giant like MasterCard making a big move like that, moving into a stablecoin infrastructure, what signal are you observing from this acquisition on your side?
Look, I think it's validation of our industry, right? It's very, very clear. It's great news for BVNK and great news for the industry at large, I would say. And it's definitely an exciting development for us and for our customers. But as we all know, digital assets powered by blockchain technology have the potential to make money movement faster and simpler, in essence, right? And I think this big, bold move by MasterCard, like I mentioned earlier, validates that is actually happening, and not that it's going to happen, but it's actually happening. So yeah, it's a different space to what it was 5 years ago, where certain big financial institutions were totally allergic to stablecoins and the blockchain space. And today it's a very, very different story. So I think all in all, for all of us in the space, this is great news.
Yeah, as you said, it's validation, it's maturity as well, something we've been seeking for quite some time. Real events of our ecosystem, also proving that the infrastructure on our side, the blockchain infrastructure, is coming to maturity, as we just talked about. To turn that into iGaming specifically, like the initial point of having you, my motivation to have you in this podcast and episode was an article you did around the evolution of stablecoins within the iGaming scene, like what's really happening. And I feel like iGaming has a long, colorful history with digital assets, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later as well. For listeners who might only associate crypto with early unregulated offshore casinos, how will you describe the actual evolution of this space? Where did we start, and what does a mature stablecoins infrastructure look like in the iGaming scene today, according to you?
Yeah, good. Look, there's a lot to unpack there, and a great question, Flavian. I think if we take a few steps back and try and understand where we've come from and where we're going, it serves its purpose, because it kind of puts certain things into context, and it's easier to kind of understand the evolution of this space and where it's taken it, or where we've taken it in iGaming. Initially, Bitcoin and crypto were used to bypass certain restrictions, which in the gaming space, particularly in the grayer markets, all these restrictions were really in place. With iGaming companies, they struggled, they would be off-boarded, and so it became almost a necessity for some of these operators and some of those players to have to use an alternative, right? And that might also be the reason, or part of the reason, I would say, I wouldn't say it in its entirety, why there is a huge correlation of ownership between people who gamble and people in the crypto space, right? Okay. That's where we came from.
Sure.
But everything's matured and evolved into a different space now. Fast forward to the time we are in now, when obviously stablecoins 5-6 years ago kind of became far more mature and mainstream with the deep liquidity that we see nowadays. And then the payments use case came into fruition, right? Without that kind of uncertainty, with the volatility which came in with those first iterations of iGaming and Bitcoin potentially, right? If we're talking, or I would say it was Bitcoin predominantly back in those days. And it's interesting to see, I mean, we can unpack where iGaming's kind of proper traction came from in terms of crypto, and that's very, very clearly, as in the middle ground somewhere of that trajectory, was emerging markets, right? And the need for people who are in places where they were exposed to hyperinflation, so they needed sheltering from their local currency effectively. They would never have access to US dollars any other way. So then these stable coins gave them access to financial instruments, which until before then was non-existent to them, right? Sure. And that kind of almost empowerment to those people, where they had custody of their own funds 24/7 for the first time in history, right? In the Western world, we kind of seem to think that that's just a given, because more or less, even though things are not working as we'd like them to work, probably in terms of our monetary and financial systems, they're not broken enough for us to really think, I want something that drastically changes the dynamic of what we experience today. And in these emerging markets, that is the case, right? A lot of these things were broken. A lot of these things, that their local currency just devalues immediately. As we're speaking here, that literally devalues their currency. And so this ticked a lot of green boxes for a lot of people from the consumer side.
And it feels like those consumers and those populations were quite from their usage of blockchain and crypto and stablecoins. They actually got educated on financial instrument, like access to financial instruments from the crypto and from stablecoins. Do you feel like it was also a way for them to be involved in the financial system they couldn't be involved so much before, or it's a kind of another population we're talking about?
100%. That is a fact, right? It also gave people, or at least the feeling of a certain level of autonomy, which allowed them opportunities that otherwise didn't exist before. And so it almost brought not a level playing field, but a closing in that gap, or that wasn't a perceived gap, was a very real gap that certain people around the world, whether it was places in Africa, certain places in Asia, in LATAM, those are definitely where the traction and the driving force behind the initial adoption of stablecoins and crypto, but more specifically stablecoins, more around the conversation we're having today, and specifically around iGaming.
Okay, talk to me about this necessity you start with explaining from the beginning for iGaming companies, for crypto specifically. What was this necessity to actually use it? Was it to be the bridge between a more easy payment infrastructure rather than what they have and what they need to rely on in terms of compliance, or is it something else?
I think there's a mixed bag, right? There's probably a few columns, and you can list the motivations of different types of operators operating in different parts of the world. And you have this whole spectrum, right? You have the spectrum of totally black, not even gray markets, black markets, where it's totally unregulated. They just don't want to have any control. So, that pseudo anonymity, that's kind of the initial, like Bitcoin brought to the system. But then you have the whole highly regulated stuff, which is the interesting stuff for us. And I know we're going to start talking about that in due course. And then there's everything in between. And so it really depended, I think, again, just touching upon the point I made earlier, where the initial use case came from was people who, one, either wanted to circumvent to a certain extent, although then they started, in today's world, it's not that easy to circumvent. And again, we can go into a bit more detail of that, because unfortunately, people still think out there that crypto can circumvent. And in many ways, it's there's far more information that you can derive from crypto transactions than from fiat transactions. And we can go into that in more detail. And then there was the second bag from the initial bunch, which was the need to find an alternative solution, because they were at the mercy of financial institutions, PSPs, banks, which were cutting them off, and that was
the middleman.
That was the lifeblood of their business. And they thought this was a way where they could take a certain element of control back over their business, which they didn't have before.
Okay, I love it. And obviously, as you said, we focus on the regulated markets on our side. And last summer, the Genius Act finally put rules, federal rules on paper for stablecoins in the USA, like the mandatory one by one with reserve banking. For the iGaming business owners who were terrified traditionally about crypto volatility and the gray areas and the black areas we just talked about, do you feel like these legislations act, although I know that it's a little bit it's a little bit not easy, we are in a difficult state in the US in terms of the Clarity Act happening right now of the past weeks, but then do you feel like this happening in the US, and we know that something happened as well in other part of the world, a little bit like MiCA in the EU, but also Hong Kong actually did something on their side. Did these legislation act as a green light for iGaming companies to understand a little bit better about the benefit of stablecoin infrastructure?
Look, 100%, right? Everything that was missing is starting to come into play now. What was missing was that regulatory clarity, if you're working in the highly regulated space, of which this is what we're talking about, what was missing was this kind of, there was a lot of ambiguity. So there was missing that kind of certainty and clarity. Genius Act, you're right to indicate, was the big first step in that. In the US, we can talk about many other regulated jurisdictions and the nuance around the regulatory landscapes and all of those. But and of course, you mentioned MiCA in Europe, which is again another big critical one when we're talking about the global landscape. Genius Act was a great first step in the US, and that started to change the conversation and the conversations that we are having also with the highly regulated gambling companies out there. But clarity is still also needed. The Clarity Act is still needed, right? It's that kind of second layer of comfort. But unfortunately, at the moment, we just seem to be navigating a macro environment which is not conducive to certainty, right? There's this kind of nervousness around it all and the macro, but we're definitely heading in the right direction. We're very, very close to getting clarity. It seems what shape and form that takes remains to be seen. We hear certain things in certain corridors. Let's see what that means. And when it actually comes into play, there's certain factions which think it's not as close as some people might believe. There's others who think it's totally imminent. Nonetheless, the conversations with those iGaming players are very different to what they were 12 and 18 months ago, which is great. They now acknowledge that this has to happen, right? It's not an if, but a when. And it's interesting to see within that space the type of players and how quickly they can move, how agile they are. The big incumbents who are very, very big, and maybe even the PLCs, they have other considerations to take when making big moves. Remember, at the end of the day, the gambling industry, although it's one of the most highly regulated industries out there, particularly in the regulated space, it is still one that receives a lot of heat, right? Whether it's from public perception, whether it's from certain areas of the media. And so the big companies try to navigate it with that extra note of caution. And of course, that comes into play, understandably so. So it's interesting. You're seeing like the mid-tier players or the privately owned players seem to have a bit more of an appetite to move a bit quicker and try and get ahead of it and try and gain some sort of competitive advantage. Let me just give you a bit of insight. We are seeing people in the social casino space, for example, in the US, who do adopt crypto or stablecoins as part of their rails and payment infrastructure. Between 1% and 5% of their whole take deposits in stablecoins. Wow. Now that's interesting. It's also a spectrum. 1% is very different to 5%. One could say that's still very low, but when you're talking about hundreds of millions in deposit volume, it's actually quite significant. Sure. And if you're not offering that, it's something that your competitors are getting market share on rather than you, because you're not offering it. But within that 1% to 5%, it's really interesting to see the scale of what people are doing. And I bucket it as the passive and the non-passive operators, people who are being proactive and the people who are being passive about it. And that's the ones who are passive, you're seeing a 1% uptake only. The people who are actually being proactive about it, and we can go into more detail as to what that means and in practice, are seeing 4% and 5% of the deposit volumes today in some cases. So that's an interesting, evolution of the space, and is a good indication of that type of player and what could really mean for the highly regulated iGaming space too.
So many questions coming from this, because it's super interesting. Usually when you have companies trying to understand a little bit better, it's, as you said, it's not if, it's when. What was the trigger according to you? Usually what's happening is, okay, someone is doing it, so I have to do the same because it feels like it's working. Are you in this situation in iGaming where you can actually, with the facts you have, explain that this is actually valuable for your business and we have the proof? What's the trigger on their side to try to understand a little bit better?
Great question. It's a chicken and egg scenario sometimes, right? It's like, for them, it's how do we validate this without validating it? It's hard. No. And they're trying to see, but at the same time, they're thinking, We can't just ignore it and then try and react when all our competitors are doing it too. There's a huge ownership rate of stablecoins in the US. That's a fact. And it's actually higher than pretty much all of the developed world, let's say. And so, there's a stablecoin report which we have released recently, which has a lot of this detail. We went into a lot of in-depth analysis on this. And people are using stablecoins in certain scenarios. But here's the key. And this is where the operators that are going to win understand. You cannot change people's behaviors, ingrained behaviors, by just putting an additional payments method and not doing anything about it. Just for example, just adding on your cashier an alternative payment method, let's call it stablecoins, at the bottom of the list, and just leaving it there, and then 6 months down the road going, oh, there wasn't much adoption on it. That proves it doesn't have a use case. I think that's looking at it the wrong way around. The ones who really understand it are going, hang on, yes, people have been using, let's say the US, for example. Let's just stay on the US, and we can talk about Europe. We can talk about other regulated jurisdictions too, where there's different nuance, different payment methods that have, market share there, etc., and would be distinct in terms of this analysis. But if we look at the US specifically, card payments are still very, very dominant.
Okay.
And they have been for the last 20, 30 years. And so for user behavior, which has been ingrained and becomes habitual, you have to undo those behaviors. And that's not easy. You're not going to achieve that just by offering an alternative payment method. If I'm used to doing something every single day of my life for years, I need to have a motivation to change that behavior.
Sure.
And that's up to the operator too. There's certain responsibility that falls to the operator in terms of understanding, okay, we need to do something proactively about that. And that's what we can go into a bit more detail of what we're seeing and the conversations that we're having, because there's a lot of things that you can do in the iGaming, regulated iGaming space to incentivize people to use an alternative payment method, which is all in your interests as an operator and in the interest of the consumer too.
To be the devil's advocate on that, because I do rely on what you said, fully agree as well. It seems like, and I've been involved, I'm not an OG as you are, but obviously I've been involved in crypto since 2021, and we were always saying, we are the solution, just adapt to the solution. And it feels like for the past 1 or 2 years, we understand as an industry that it cannot come from this, and we have to change our behavior as well, trying to merge with what's already happening in terms of what's already in place in terms of infrastructure in the financial system, in the gaming ecosystem infrastructure as well. So we need to rely a little bit and make things a little bit easier for them to rely on a new technology, which is blockchain and stablecoins, but making sure that we don't change too much of their day-to-day life, whether it's for the developer of a big company or whether it's a player. So do you agree on this statement?
Look, user experience is critical, right? Always. Without the user experience being the same at the very least or better than what people have been accustomed to, it will fail, right? And I think we've come leaps and bounds. But to your point, I think you open up a really valid area of conversation, which is there has to be more than just payments. But the beauty of it is that for the first time ever, we have a technology stack which radically changes the way that everything else can develop on.
Sure.
There's far too many operators out there who are just thinking of blockchain as payments. And the ones who are going to really innovate, in my opinion, and are innovating, in my opinion, and it would be interesting to see over the next 5 to 10 years, are people who are building their stacks or are crypto native. So you look at the stake.coms, all these kind of crypto native casinos, which have built their stack on blockchains. It will be interesting to see how they evolve. This is my personal view on this stuff. Because your foot in the door is payments, true. But because you now have a blockchain stack, doesn't stop there. What about loyalty? What about VIP rewards? What about rewarding your customers in a way that they don't have to trust you, but that you can let them verify you? How about having a community-driven jackpots? All of this stuff, which is immutable and verifiable on blockchain, now becomes all these extra layers that is going to come from people who at least started on the payment stack on blockchain. But if you're not in there in the first place, you will not be able to benefit from all that innovation that's going to come from the blockchain. And there's far too many people stuck in blockchain is payments. But there's so much other stuff, transferable assets. Now loyalty or bonuses. Bonuses don't have to become just a manual task, which doesn't really achieve much, but it could become something that becomes an asset to the consumer, to the player. And now they can trade it potentially. There's so much innovation that can come from it, because now you've got a stack that allows you to do that in a verifiable way where Mats proves it and not somebody behind a desk. And from the operator side, yes, it might seem that from the world we've come from, this is a big change, and it just, how do we take control of it? But it's like everything, opportunities with new technologies, new opportunities come along, and a lot of manual and menial tasks would totally disappear because everything could become programmable on the blockchain. It's not just payments. But anyway, that could be an entire session in its own right, I think, talking about the benefits. And it's the incumbents are not in prime position today, most of them, to take advantage of what blockchain has to offer. They're too fixated on this might just be stable coins. We'll do it at some point. In the meantime, those who've built their stack with blockchain as their main kind of a tech stack are going to be able to benefit from that and in a compounding fashion over the next few years, in my opinion.
I love this because it feels like for the past 5-6 years, us, Blockchain Game Alliance, but also representing the gaming scene, the blockchain space in the gaming scene, we always try to define our foot in the door, as you said, and it was ownership of digital asset, like the full custody of your digital assets and doing whatever you want. We got a lot of backlash from that, from example I'm not going to mention for sure, but it was misunderstood / not very well explained. Feels like, as you said, the financial rails that we're having right now, and that's what motivates us to do the stablecoins in gaming report last year, was this foot in the door that we were looking for. And as you said, we're going to introduce a lot of other mechanics from having these blockchain stacks. So I do rely on everything you said, Ed, and it's very interesting. Like, if we try to go back to regulation, as you said, Gibraltar, main country in the world to actually understand the value of the importance of regulation in the iGaming scene. Malta is a little bit like that too. They practically wrote the global regulatory playbook for those two companies for iGaming. Do you believe those countries have the capacity and the right DNA to actually do the exact same thing for digital assets and stablecoins payment? What do you think? I know that BVNK just secured this MiCA license, so congratulations for that in Malta last month. How critical is it that these specific jurisdictions lead the way in bridging gaming and stablecoin regulation, according to you?
Look, they're going to be the pioneers and the leaders in this field too, like they have been the pioneers in iGaming, right? You're right, we have received our MiCA license, which is great. And the Maltese gaming regulator is receptive to crypto and is open to having these type of conversations. There is a registration regime with them to be able to offer virtual assets. And in Gibraltar, a similar thing. I know the regulator and the people there running it very, very well. And I've been involved with getting approvals for certain names here already. What they'd love to see is that people, operators, are giving the right considerations in the areas that really matter to them, right? But the beauty is that as a regulatory structure and as jurisdictions, both Gibraltar and Malta, I think in answer to your question, they're very well versed in the higher risk, what are defined as higher risk industries, because they've been at the forefront and the pioneers in gambling. They're very, very comfortable with AML controls. They're very, very comfortable with all the things that also kind of become very important and prescient within the crypto community, right? And so I think apart from that, there's the agility that comes with being smaller jurisdictions. there's less red tape in terms of moving quick, right? Gibraltar was the first to issue a DLT framework back in 2017. And I know they're currently revising that framework. I was talking to somebody at the regulator yesterday, for example, and there's a lot of work going in there to revamp and bring it back in line with how trends have moved on and how the industry has moved. And so small jurisdictions like that can be much more agile and adapt to things much quicker. So that's a big benefit.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, look, they're going to continue to be at the forefront of it. They seem to be, from the history and the track record, regulators and with the political appetite within those jurisdictions generally, I must say, to be at the forefront of innovation. And if you want to innovate, you cannot wait until things then become, and then say, okay, now this is just part of life's fabric of society, and now we regulate this industry. That's not how innovation is kind of helped. It needs to be kind of at the forefront of it. And I think Gibraltar and Malta are definitely in a great space on that. The US is moving very, very quickly when it comes to gaming. Each state is its own world. And there is either a registration regime or a licensing regime if you want to offer crypto services to iGaming operators. That's separate to MTL licenses or MSB licenses. There is a regime with the state gambling regulators, which you need to go through. And of course, that's another one to navigate in the US, because there's a different nuance in how the US operates. But they're definitely open now to having those discussions hand in hand with an operator and somebody who is expert in dealing with digital assets and getting that over the line. So those conversations are definitely interesting. All in all, everything is progressing in the regulated space, some more swiftly than others, but interesting nonetheless, Flavio.
But definitely saying that even if there are a lot of differences between the US and the EU and other countries, it really feels like what's happening in the US for the past 1-2 years is really having a snowball effect on other countries to say, okay, we need to do something on our side too, which is quite positive, definitely. I wanted to touch lastly on something you mentioned. So we talk about this foot in the door. It's gonna help you and your business in terms of setting up an effective financial rails using stablecoins, but you can do more. And you talk about loyalty. So what do you see? How do you see stablecoins playing a role in that specifically?
Yeah, look, and I think this is where the innovation has to come, right? And there's all sorts of conversations, and who's going to win at it? Let's see. It's not for me to kind of, I'm not running a casino, but I'm involved with lots of the conversations, and it's very, very obvious that loyalty on the blockchain has a lot of other benefits that, the manual menial task of which currently kind of operates under will be able to afford operators. And so where they take it will be interesting. This kind of VIP rewards, whether you start giving people, I don't know, NFTs, which become tradable, this interoperability. For example, the fact that people can verify who they are on their wallets, maybe using self-sovereign digital identities, right? Self-sovereign DIDs, not DIDs issued by their own governments, but self-sovereign DIDs using ZK, for example, zero knowledge proofs. Now that gives the ability for a user to be able to, move around easily without having to onboard with every single operator. And from the operator side, it gives them an opportunity to really innovate when it comes to onboarding, which is evidently one of the big friction points when it comes to onboarding customers because of all the KYC. Well, here is the opportunity for those who want to embrace it to change massively the dynamic of how this has always worked. But it's hard, right? Because the easy thing for most people to do is just look at what has happened before and fit in what the future is going to look like with what happened before. And very few people are able to say, well, that's not the world we're going to live in. The world we're going to live in is going to be it's a paradigm shift to where we are today. And that requires a lot of, it requires a brave person. It's people who have that vision, people who have that kind of stepping away from the modus operandi or the status quo and not just fall in, okay, this is how it's always been done. We just need to kind of maybe evolve it a bit. This is like a paradigm shift. You can now, for the first time, look at changing the fabric of everything and how you operate as an operator. Requires some guts, though.
It does, yeah. And to be honest with you, it feels like we definitely not at the end of the world based on that in terms of acceptance of the industry about how to use blockchain in different ways. We want mechanics, loyalty, although and not. It wasn't on purpose, but we're working on a playbook because it feels like reward systems are. It is a thing in the gaming scene, like everyone is talking about that. I'm not saying iGaming, but in the gaming scene, we actually value the fact that we have to put effective reward system within a game in the long run and not just at the beginning for acquisition purposes. So we try to match that shift in the industry, in the gaming industry, with what's happening in the blockchain space, and we're working on that with incredible members. Hopefully I will bring you some good case studies we have in-house to just paint what you just described on your side. But I'm excited with what's happening for BVNK on a lot of different levels, and I will definitely follow up on every one of your activity personally based on your responsibility within the company. And I really enjoy the conversation. Thanks a lot for bringing your expertise. I wish we had 1 hour, to be honest with you, because I have so much other topics to cover. But I also think that it's going to be interesting to follow up on those topics in the next 6 months to see what's happening. So thanks a lot, Jamie, for your time. I really appreciate that. And I hope to see you very soon.
Flavian, thank you very much. Really enjoyed that conversation. And yeah, let's stay in touch.
Thank you, Jamie.